hope, our faith, our spirit, our dreams. Their faces reflect innocence, wonder, amazement, and trust. As a society, we long ago vowed to take care of the children, to keep them warm, to shelter them from harm, and to provide them an education, proper nourishment, and adequate health care. We promised each and every one of them, no matter their race, religion, or family income, a chance at the American dream. But over the last 25 years, we've broken our pledge to the children. More and more of the youngest Americans are raised in poverty and in single-parent homes. Their schools and streets are not safe. Drugs, violent crime, and gangs infest their neighborhoods. Even children who live in small towns and suburbs cannot escape the dangers of growing up in the 90s. We have not protected the children, and now are paying the price, a toll too high for our nation to bear. In this program, we'll examine the impact of violence on children, its roots, and the consequences for our society. Plus, we'll look at long-term solutions to the rapidly escalating problem that touches all of us. Violence permeates the lives of American children, no matter where they live. They see gratuitous violence on television and in the movies. Many toys and video games promote aggressive behavior. Some rap and heavy metal music often glamorizes and encourages violent acts, especially against women. And children watch news reports of murders, drug wars, rapes, drive-by shootings, missing children, and other violent crimes. Children sense the presence of violence in their schools and their neighborhoods. Metal detectors are the rule rather than the exception in many school districts. In some areas, particularly inner cities, children cannot walk to school, ride their bikes, or play in a park without fear of gunfire. Gangs, which used to haunt large metropolitan areas, now infiltrate even the smallest towns in America. Children experience violence in their own homes. A study by the U.S. Advisory Board on Child Abuse and Neglect estimates that at least 2,000 children die every year of abuse and neglect. Another 18,000 are permanently disabled, and 142,000 are seriously injured. Thousands of others suffer deep-seated psychological wounds. Too many children witness domestic abuse, living in fear of fathers who beat and belittle their mothers. James Stayer is founder and president of Children Now, one of the country's leading policy and advocacy groups for children's issues.
It's clear that we've let the quality of life for kids in this country go downhill for 20 or 25 years now. Ask anybody and say, do you think it's easier being a kid today than it was when you were a kid? And I've never met an adult in this country who didn't think that it was tougher to be a kid today than it was when they were growing up. And that's a very powerful statement. It says that we aren't a child-friendly society.
Violence surrounds our children, and our culture is reeling from the effects. Perhaps what has scared Americans the most, and what has precipitated the call for reform, is the upsurge in youth violence. Adolescents are now the perpetrators as well as the victims. FBI statistics reveal a frightening scenario. Between 1983 and 1992, the number of juveniles arrested for aggravated assault, rape, robbery, and murder increased 47%. In that same time span, the number of young people arrested for weapons law violations jumped 60%. And the number of children under the age of 18 arrested for murder skyrocketed 128%. One study by Professor James Fox, Dean of the College of Criminal Justice at Northeastern University, found that the incidence of teenagers aged 14 to 17 who were charged with murder increased by 162% from 1985 to 1993. The rate of the number of children aged 13 and younger charged with murder rose by 50% in the same period. Overall, the crime rate for adults remained steady and in some areas even declined. Dr. James Garbarino is director of the Family Life Development Center at Cornell University.
Children who are hit, children who are beaten, are likely to draw the conclusion that hitting and beating are the normal strategies for influencing people. So there are a lot of origins of violence.
A combination of biological, psychological, and sociological factors contribute to a child's propensity toward violent behavior. When a child experiences more than one of these risks, the outcome is often volatile.
And I think what we've seen is more and more children living with a buildup of risk factors because of family changes or instability, because of the worsening economic climate for young children, because of the changes in the institutional life of the community. And when you couple that with the fact that you have so much violence on television, which is a poisonous influence, that you have unresolved issues of racism and oppression in the society, when you have the nastiness of so much of the culture children are exposed to. It's that combination that is the real challenge to my mind.
Most experts agree that children who witness or experience violence at an early age are those at the highest risk for committing violent crime. Each year, nearly 3 million children are abused and neglected by those who are supposed to love and protect them. Doctors, teachers, and law enforcement officials are required by law to report suspected abuse. But many incidents go undetected, and symptoms are frequently misdiagnosed. Oftentimes, friends, neighbors, and other family members look the other way or think hitting is an acceptable form of punishment. Clearly, it is not. Violently hitting a child teaches him or her that violence is an acceptable form of behavior, a suitable means of resolving conflict. When children who are abused grow older, they repeat the pattern of abuse since that's the only method they understand. Lois Salisbury, Executive Director of Children Now, knows no child is safe.
We know domestic violence knows no borders of class or race. Domestic violence and child abuse are rampant in many different communities around this country. And in some instances, the more isolated or rural the community, the more intense it may well be. But it's everywhere.
A 1992 study by the National Institute of Justice reported that being abused or neglected as a child increased the likelihood of arrest as a juvenile by 53%, and as an adult by 38%. Being abused as a child increases that child's chances of arrest for a violent crime by 38% as well.
So obviously a very big factor in violence are kids who aren't getting the kind of parental love and support that they need, who aren't getting the kind of guidance they need and very clear sense of right and wrong that they need from their parents and from their schools and from society at large. There's a complex web of factors that go into kids growing up and becoming violent.
In the United States, nearly 1 million teenagers are victims of violent crimes each year. Children who have experienced violence firsthand suffer long-lasting psychological effects as well as physical injuries. They often withdraw, lose sleep, and become more fearful. Their self-confidence and self-esteem plummet. Their ability to learn and concentrate is affected as they often become disruptive in school. They feel despair and hopelessness. Children who witness recurring violence exhibit the same type of behavior. Kathleen Kostelny, Senior Research Associate at the Erickson Institute for Advanced Study in Child Development in Chicago, discusses the repercussions.
Certainly, in the most troubled children and the most troubled adolescents, what we're finding is that they're subject to a whole host of risks in their life, and it's the accumulation of these risks that get manifest then in these symptoms of violence and suicide and teen pregnancy and whatnot. that what we found is that children can cope with one or two risk factors in their lives and do well, but it's when the risks start building up that children just fall apart.
Children who grow up in war zones often at least believe their lives will improve when the conflict is over. They feel there's a cause, a reason for the fighting. But American children who face violence every day have little hope that it will end. The violence in their urban war zone is senseless and random. Even if they have been a crime victim, young people today are growing up in fear. Their hopes and dreams are defined by the harsh reality of their daily lives. A poll of children aged 10 to 17, commissioned by Newsweek, revealed worries and anxieties their parents never knew. 56% of the children feared that someone in their family would become a victim of a violent crime. Only 1/3 thought they would surpass their parents financially. 1 in 5 children said it was not safe to walk in their neighborhood after dark. Today's kids worry about drugs, gangs, crime, divorce, unemployment, and homelessness. Fears unheard of just a generation ago.
Well, I think children are living in a much more socially toxic environment these days, and it's toxic from a whole range of influences. I mean, just what they're being fed on the TV, the level of violence and aggression and hate, having to deal with just what you need to do to be a teenager and be independent and act out. I mean, you know, it's much different today than it was 40 years ago.
In part, the increased anxiety of being a crime victim comes from television. Children are bombarded with violent images during entertainment programming available to them 24 hours a day, thanks to a relaxing of broadcast standards and ever-increasing cable offerings.
Guns are cool.
Children Now estimates that the current generation of television viewers will see 600 times more assaults, 500 times more rapes, and 300 times more murders on television than previous generations. The American Psychological Association says the average child witnesses 8,000 murders and more than 100,000 other acts of violence before reaching high school. Dr. Carl Bell is head of the Community Mental Health Council on Chicago's South Side.
One of the reactions that people have from being stressed by being exposed to violence is that they get very scared and they begin to carry weapons. And then they get into an argument with a family member or a friend, and the weapon that they were originally carrying in their mind to protect themselves kills a wife, kills a husband, kills a friend. Some people who are victims of violence learn from that it's better to be, the best defense is a good offense. So rather than be a victim or a prey, they'd rather be a predator. And that's how they structure their existence.
Watching so much violence also desensitizes children to the problem. Television rarely illuminates the consequences of violent acts. The news media also heighten children's fears. Most children see a negative image of themselves in the news, while most young people, especially teenagers, are doing fine in real life. Adolescents portrayed in news reports are almost always involved in crime, drugs, or violence. Young people feel the media is misrepresenting their generation.
Because kids get some of their own self-image and some of their own self-conception from the way that they're portrayed in the ever-increasing amount of media that surrounds them. And so I think that it's very important for us to get the true facts about kids today and to recognize that most kids are doing fine and most are struggling against the kinds of challenges that they're facing today in the 90s.
Another common denominator among violent children and those who witness violence in their everyday lives is poverty. Poverty breeds a host of social ills that contribute to violence: unemployment, teenage pregnancy, drugs, abuse, crime. It's a maze of hazards where one roadblock leads to another. Children raised in poverty often have parents who are unemployed or underemployed, and that creates enormous stress on those parents who often are not prepared to be parents in the first place. The environment is a breeding ground for abuse. Children in poverty are often alone and unsupervised, with no appropriate role models in their lives. If a father is out of the picture and the mother has her own problems, the children must look elsewhere for love and companionship. They become easy targets for gangs, drug dealers, and other criminals. James Houston, an associate professor at Appalachian State University, is considered an expert on gang behavior.
The greatest challenge for young people today is to be able to walk around the attractiveness of delinquency and criminal behavior. Let's face it, it is attractive to use drugs, participate in illicit sex, to hop school, or do whatever. But young kids have got to stay focused, and they have to realize that there is a payoff, or consequences, I should say, 5 and 10 years down the road.
Children who grow up in poverty are often undernourished and do poorly in school. They often drop out, leaving them with no educational or vocational opportunities to develop meaningful careers. 1 in 5 children in America live in poverty. Over the last 2 decades, the gap between rich and poor has widened, with the middle class almost slipping into oblivion. We have become a society of the haves and the have-nots. In the 50s and 60s, young men who didn't finish high school or college could still make a decent living by working in a factory or manufacturing job. Others turned to the military for direction and a career. But today, a young man without an education finds that the doors of opportunity are closed to him. He may feel powerless to obtain a meaningful lifestyle and a way to support his family through legitimate means.
I think the single greatest cause of violence, if you could single one thing out in this very complex phenomenon, is poverty. And you should recognize that the majority of poor kids in this country are white. But poverty and its attendant problems, whether it's educational failure, lack of quality health care and nutrition and child care, oftentimes leading to family breakup, this is probably the single greatest deprivation that kids face today, and that in face of that deprivation, kids oftentimes see a much less hopeful future.
Kids of all economic levels have felt the consequences of the breakdown of the American family. Over half of all children born today will spend some time in a single-parent family before they reach 18. 30% of today's births are to single mothers, and just under half of those children born to 2 parents will witness a divorce. Sarah McClanahan, a professor at Princeton University who has studied children of single-parent families, sees a direct correlation between a child's home environment and violence.
A child from a single-parent family is twice the risk of being in jail before they're age 20 as a child that's raised in a 2-parent family.
But children who are raised in single-parent homes are also more likely to live in poverty. So critics assert that the number of parents a child has is not as accurate a predictor of violence as poverty. Still, most experts who work with children believe in the concept of family values.
Plain and simple, the family is the most important institution in a child's life. If you don't have the kind of support and love and steady nurturance that you need from your family, it's so much more likely that you're going to end up in trouble in one way or another. If we want to focus on violence prevention in this society, then we ought to focus on keeping families together and supporting families as our #1 priority.
Poverty, abuse and neglect, television, drugs, failure in school, and an unstable home life all contribute to violence. But most experts agree that what often increases the likelihood that deadly violence will occur is the presence of a gun. Dr. Catherine Coffer-Christoffel, professor of pediatrics and preventive medicine at Northwestern University Medical School, has treated too many young gunshot victims to ignore the problems created by guns.
If you have a handgun in the house, it's much more likely to kill a family member than an intruder. That ratio is 43-1 in one study. We know that if you have firearms in the house, the risk of suicide goes up 5-fold, the risk of homicide goes up 3-fold. And in families with a history of domestic violence, those families are 20 times more likely to experience a homicide, and the homicide is usually committed with a handgun.
Every day, 13 American children are murdered with guns. An adolescent is more likely to die of gun violence than of an illness. An estimated 8.7 million children in this country have access to handguns, according to the Center to Prevent Handgun Violence.
I think the evidence is pretty clear that it's the availability of handguns in the hands of young people that has produced the upswing in fatal violence among teenagers and seriously debilitating violence. Guns make it easier to translate conflict into damage. And beyond that even, guns have a kind of cultural significance. I mean, there are studies that say simply putting a gun in a room will produce more verbal aggression among people. It arouses people. It has such symbolic value that I think it's very much implicated in the problem that we're concerned about.
Between 1979 and 1991, nearly 50,000 children were killed by firearms, a total equivalent to the number of American battle casualties in the Vietnam War. Guns figure in more than 75% of adolescent homicides and more than half of adolescent suicides. The impact of violence on children has touched every family, every neighborhood, every community in America. The problem cuts across racial, economic, and geographic lines. We cannot ignore the problem any longer. We must save the children. Schools and communities must collaborate to provide safe havens for children, to give them alternatives to violence and crime. Providing recreational opportunities and extracurricular programs help children fill the hours when they are unsupervised at home or on the streets.
The youth opportunity that can make or break a child's outlook on life and who they are and what options they're willing to exercise is the essence of what's going to prevent violence.
Children must feel valued, must feel their lives and concerns are important, that someone cares about what happens to them. Joy Dreyfus, author of the book Adolescence at Risk, thinks American children need to hear that voice.
We have to make it clear to young people that we value them. At the moment, I'm sure they feel that we don't. If we valued them, we wouldn't allow them to live in such great jeopardy. We wouldn't allow them to suffer because of their race or because of their social class or because of their immigration status. We would try to create institutions that help them celebrate their youth, which is what you're supposed to be doing when you're young.
Conflict resolution must become part of a child's curriculum, especially since some experts say a child's aggressive behavior at age 8 predicts that child's tendency toward violence at age 30. As a part of his work, Garbarino has written a workbook entitled Let's Talk About Living in a World with Violence that helps teach children nonviolent and positive ways to settle differences and manage anger.
Getting to them early, by the time they're age 8, is very important in preventing a full-blown pattern of violence from developing. And as the years go on, as you move into adolescence, there's certainly a need to focus on nonviolent conflict resolution.
Perhaps most importantly, we must remove guns from children's hands. Children, because of their curiosity and sense of immortality, have always been attracted to guns. Teenagers particularly seek the thrill of danger and rebellion. Although the issue of gun control is one which continues to divide this country, many, especially in the medical profession, advocate confronting the problem as a public health and safety crisis.
The Handgun Epidemic Lowering Plan Network, the HELP Network, is an organization of organizations which agree on two things. First of all, that it is fruitful to look at this as a health problem, not just as a crime problem. And that really is a different way of looking at it. Traditionally, gunshot wounds are a crime problem because if you misuse a gun, it's a crime. And of course that's true, it is a crime problem. However, we've been going at it that way for a long time and things are just getting worse. It's also true that it's a health problem because people are maimed and they bleed and they get handicapped as a result of it and they die. So it also is a health problem.
As a nation, we must heed the warning signals. Turning our heads away from children and violence will mean more offenders, more jails, more crime, more fear, and more death. When the children died in the Oklahoma City bombing, the nation wept for their parents, their siblings, their lost lives. As a nation, we must gather our strength, our resources, and our compassion for all children, as we did for those children in Oklahoma City. We must renew our commitment to the children, to give them a world that is safe, fair, and just. We all must consider ourselves role models and accept that responsibility seriously. We must, as some say, walk our talk. An old African proverb reminds us that it takes an entire village to raise a child. Our nation must choose to do just that.